Greetings, pearl-shaped humans. Take me to your leader. Oh, howdy, Larry. So I am excited to be back at the Perl conference with all of you, and simultaneously back in my hometown. So thanks for having me here today. My name is Nova Patch, and I was spending some time with my father on Father's Day. I normally don't come down, but the Perl conference united me and my dad this weekend. He is really into like vintage motorcycles and old records and tube amps. And I was like, Dad, I think you'd really like this conference this week. It's like the classic auto show of programming languages. But don't tell my Perl friends. But as you'll see, that's a compliment. As you'll see, I'm a big fan of Perl, and it can help us to accomplish some of our goals, which are to build things for humans to consume, or for humans to collaborate. So today is a cookbook for humans, and I'm about to blow off the dust and lock the doors. I'm a principal engineer at Shutterstock, where I focus on internationalization and localization. We support 20 languages, which I've had the pleasure of working on introducing 10 of those languages, and that has introduced a lot of complexity. There have been so many problems that we have had to solve in Perl, in JavaScript, in our databases, in the fonts we use. And I'm going to share just one of those major problems here today. I'm also a member of the Unicode Consortium and am a contributor to the Unicode Common Locale Data Repository, the CLDR, which is a standardized repository for locale data. Because the Unicode is a lot more than just a massive amount of characters. And it's a lot more than not just UTF-8, but several encodings for those characters. It also is a set of standards for working not just with characters, but text in general, as well as, I mentioned, locale data, and so on and so on. There is a massive conference just for Unicode. It's the Internationalization Unicode Conference in October, November in Santa Clara each year. I highly recommend it to dig more into this. But this is one of the last talks of this conference, and we only have 50 minutes. So we need to keep this one limited. So Perl truly is the Swiss Army chainsaw, even in the Unicode world. You don't get many Python programmers saying good things about Perl. But this was a quote from Python in a talk titled "The Guts of Unicode in Python." Perl has some of the best Unicode support today, especially with regard to regular expressions. And it's true. But there's a lot of confusion about how to use it. Because we're not all linguists. Are there any linguists in the audience? Okay. So you're not expected to be a linguist either. And the world is a complex place where you may have, in my case, I have 20 languages on the sites and apps that I support. But I support users all over the world from many languages that we don't officially support, but we do want them as our user. As Shutterstock as a business where we license stock media, photos, video, music, well, we want to be able to do that to anybody in the world, as well as we provide collaboration tools to create your own content using our assets and to share our content with your teammates and collaborate with them. Well, we want to make sure that you can use our tools even if you're collaborating in Arabic or Hindi, two languages that we do not support. So we don't speak to you in Arabic or Hindi, but it's so important that you can create your ads in those languages, or collaborate with your colleagues in those languages, or even just add the most basic data about yourself, your name, your address, and so forth. But this introduces a lot of characters into our systems, a lot of ones that we don't always expect, into our databases, into our front-end layers, our back-end layers, all sorts of microservices. And I think any complex system like this, you're going to find bugs, and you're going to have to decide what to support or not, because you can't cater everything to every single language out there, but you do have to know some basic ideas about what is a character. So what is a character? Well, it depends. It depends on if you ask your database. It depends on different programming languages. JavaScript will disagree with Perl. Perl 5 will disagree with Perl 6. And, well, in the case of Perl 5 versus Perl 6, it is a language moving in the right direction. So backwards compatibility is not always a good thing when it holds you into the past and makes it harder to do your job. But fortunately, I'm going to mainly cover both general topics here that you can apply to any programming language, as well as some Perl 5 examples for you. Because I bet you, let's get a raise of hand. Who programs in Perl 5 here? Okay, I see like everyone in the room answering. So back to our question. What is a character? And I don't really care what databases and programming languages think a character is. Well, if I'm programming on them, it's important to know. But I guess our users don't really care about that. Our users care about what they think a character is in their name and in their data. So we've got this term user-perceived characters. And, well, even users won't always agree on that. But there are some general rules we can follow to help support what users perceive as characters. Now, I'm not talking about ancient Egyptian pharaohs. It is true that you can parse Egyptian hieroglyphs in your Perl regular expressions, such as this Unicode property matcher for Egyptian hieroglyphs. But we're not going to get into that today, because I know for myself, people like my boss, my CEO, does not really care if we support entering and returning ancient Egyptian writing, because we have no pharaohs in our user base. So this can be a tempting thing to say, but we need to support the hieroglyphs. That's not real user data, though, and it's not always convincing that that's something that should be supported. Similarly to Mayan hieroglyphs. Now, I must note, this isn't even encoded yet. We have a script code for it, so in the future, some days down the road, Perl will support parsing Mayan hieroglyphs once they have the characters to go along with the script. But who here works at Booking.com or used to? Anyone? We got a few hands. There are a lot of Booking folks in the room. Wait, what if you told your boss the Mayan hieroglyphs are not working in our system? We need to work on it to support the Mayans. And it probably wouldn't go over very well. So that's why I like to highlight real-world user data for why we should support Unicode. And even going ahead a little in history to more recent times, we have all different legacy systems out there, like characters that were introduced on different platforms like Atari and Commodore. And Unicode's initial goal was to have compatibility, round-trip compatibility with all of these legacy encodings. I don't really care about thousands of characters in Unicode because they're not for modern usage. Just because it's in there doesn't mean it should be used. Now, it also doesn't mean that you should not support it, but it's not the reason to support Unicode. And it doesn't make for good test data, because if a test breaks, nobody really cares, because it's not the target users. But you can do regex matches against all sorts of legacy symbols, as well as more specific ones that we're not going to get into today. Now, even with new characters being encoded and modern Unicode support, there are all sorts of fun hacks, like Zalgo, where you apply combining characters on top of combining characters on top of combining characters. And it commonly breaks all of your apps and display because, well, in the real world, we don't use anything like this. You can abuse Unicode as much as you want, but it's not a real use case. And I have seen people using this in unit test data or testing apps to make sure that Unicode can work, saying, hey, if we support this, we support anything. But then again, it's not very convincing when things break that we need to maintain this. But there are a lot of really good examples of what's important to support, such as Thai. Thai is one of the languages that we introduced at Shutterstock in 2013. And it added distinct complexities that our systems did not support at the time. And we'll get into some of those examples soon. But as a complex script, where what Perl thinks as its base, Perl 5 thinks as a base unit of what a character is, can sometimes be just a portion of a character in Thai. And as of relatively recent times, we have the global rise in emoji. And love it or hate it, it is here to stay, and people will enter it into all of your forms. Note that we cannot run this in our regular expressions yet. It is something that would potentially be standardized and added in the future. But there is there are a lot of ways to parse emoji, and we'll get into some of that. Emoji has brought up some interesting issues in that most of the characters are outside of the basic multilingual plane, which is just a storage space in Unicode. And in UTF-8, they are 4 bytes. In UTF-16, they're 2 code units. Well, so many systems that were developed in the past, back in the 90s, were not developed to support these in mind, which you get MySQL's so-called UTF-8 just breaking down when you enter emoji and truncating starting at it. You get JavaScript thinking that emoji is 2 characters because it's actually reading the UTF-16 code units. And just imagine if you start splitting your strings in the middle of characters, and it just brings up problems. So let's take a look. Let's dive into some real-world text that requires more than what some systems think of as a single character, but users think of as a single character. Note this brought up an unfortunate font rendering issue, which underscores the importance of even testing your fonts. So this is 2 code points. By default, it's what Perl would think of as 2 characters if you ran length on it. And you could potentially split in between these if you were chopping up your strings. It is the Latin small letter G, that's just an ASCII character, followed by the combining diaresis. But our users don't care that Perl thinks of this as 2 characters, because they think of it as 1. There's Korean hangul that's composed of JAMO. And this one here is, Perl would say, 3 characters by default. Oh, this didn't even display correctly. Okay, well, that little dot, 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 dot circle is supposed to be missing, and this is all supposed to be composed together. It looked good for me, I promise, when I was testing this out. So anyway, Thai. It commonly has these sequences. If any of you here who are not native Thai speakers, any native Thai speakers in the room? Okay, if all of you here tried to count how many characters this is, your idea of what a character is might be different than a Thai user's idea of what a character is. Tamil can get quite complex when we start getting into the South Asian languages. Devanagari, which is a script, not a language, that is used for so many Indian languages, including Hindi. And when we start to work with this text, things can go awry. Who here in their regular expressions has used the backslash uppercase X? Yes, I see about a dozen hands up. I'm so glad that you've used it, Larry.
That's why Perl 6 does it differently.
So, in Perl 5 and in various other regex engines, not all, but PCRE as well, which multiple programming languages do use PCRE under the hood. This matches an extended grapheme cluster, which is a standardized unit. Standard by, let's see, I think unit segmentation technical report on what we consider a single user perceived character. And everything I've shown you so far is one extended grapheme cluster, or I'm just going to say grapheme cluster because we don't care about legacy grapheme clusters. And in the Perl 6 world, you commonly hear them just say graphemes. Yeah, graphemes. But in the Unicode world, you'll see this very wordy version frequently. But what about emoji? So, emoji's the relatively new kid in town. Everybody's using it, and the standard continues to grow, and all languages and applications and operating systems have to rapidly catch up with it. Every single year, they're not just adding more emoji, they're adding complex sequences of multiple code points that create single displayed emojis. Well, there's one problem, is that traditionally, grapheme clusters did not match these emoji sequences. So let's actually dive in to the technical standard on emoji to give you an idea of some of the complexity here. Now, for a lot of these things, a lot of characters we see, if you're just passing data in, passing it out, and not really working with it, well, if you're handling Unicode correctly in the first place, just as in encoding, UTF-8 for example, then things don't tend to break down. But when you start parsing it is when trouble arises. And with emoji, let's take a look. Yeah, you can all see that one. So Unicode Technical Standard 51, a continually evolving standard that the vendors like Apple and Microsoft and Twitter as well, because they've got quite a lot of built-in emoji support, are both participating in and catching up with. So let's take a look at a few of the things it goes into. Let's skip some of this. You are not expected to read all of this, but if you have an app that needs to support emoji, it is important to read through this, and it's a very interesting read. So there are emoji sequences. And it's kind of the Wild West out there. Vendors are even adding their own sequences. Like, what about the black flag with a zero width joiner. Or I found out that the president of Unicode actually pronounces the zero width joiner zwidge, followed by the skull and crossbones. Well, that could be used to represent the skull and crossbone flag. Will your app support it? Maybe, probably not. But a lot of questions with emoji are, what do we want to support? What's the minimum that we need to support to users' expectations? And where can we go from there if it's important to your users? Our first time it became important at Shutterstock was with content authoring tools like Shutterstock Editor, where we wanted people to be able to create things in their browser with our imagery and add arbitrary emoji or text from any language. So you might have seen that they recently added skin tone modifiers. These are much like the combining characters. You've got your base character, which is this person, and then these modifying emoji modifier Fitzpatrick types. And well, that creates one user perceived emoji, and well, emojis are characters. And then there are the even more complex sequences, like this woman follows, woman, zwidge, zwidge, woman, which creates this one single emoji on systems that support it. Well, let's jump back into the presentation. This was a very complex problem to try to parse out any of these emoji sequences. When we were working on Editor, there really was not a standardized solution in the JavaScript world to do this. When this was, this is not a Perl program, although other things I do in Perl. And we ended up needing to use multiple different NPM modules, one for the grapheme clusters, another one for the emoji sequences. So I'm happy to say that in Unicode 9.0, they added emoji sequences to be extended grapheme clusters, which means that in Perl 5.26, \uppercase X actually matches emoji sequences. And I think this is one of the major strengths for this new release that I don't see people talking about. It makes working with arbitrary emoji data so much easier. And to my knowledge, this is the first programming language to release this support, because PCRE, I just checked the changelogs, and it, at least from what the changelogs say, it last upgraded to Unicode 7.0 in 2015. And then, once PCRE upgrades to a new version of Unicode, the programming languages have to upgrade to a new version of PCRE. And even when Python or Ruby say that, well, Ruby has other regex engines, but even when Python and other languages that use PCRE say that they support a certain Unicode version, because Python has been known to beat Perl out to supporting the new Unicode version in some cases, their version of PCRE does not support the new Unicode version. So I have at it with Perl 5.26. I would say that if you are a Perl shop, and sometimes it takes a bit of work to upgrade your version of Perl, and one of your product requirements is to support emoji, this could be a significant case to say, let's upgrade our version of Perl, because otherwise we might require work over the next month to support these emoji sequences, whereas we could just have one meta character matcher in regular expressions to do this. So yes, you can do this in regexes, but what about when you try to use the various functions in Perl? that work on characters. Substring, well, that's going to be on code points. And there's no way to flip the mode to be a grapheme cluster mode. Now, I know Perl 6 does have the base mode being on grapheme clusters, but many of us do not have the privilege of working on our production code in Perl 6. But I love to use it for one-liners. So, you do not want to call substring and accidentally chop in the middle of characters, and therefore to the user corrupting their character. Some examples. There's been a recent rise in having a generated avatar to represent users using either their two initials or their first initial from the beginning of their name. We just recently did this with our team experience feature at Shutterstock, where it just represents the members of your team. And, well, you could just be taking a portion of that the first character in the user's name. So it's not always bad to use the functions that are built into Perl for this. You just have to think, how am I applying this? Am I potentially corrupting my user's data? And if so, you're all competent programmers, I'm sure, and you can think of more complex solutions using some of the building blocks that Perl already provides. Index, same issue, R-index, of course. Chop. Reverse, although I really don't know what you would use reverse for in the real world with user data. Like, that is not something I use for like natural language processing or formatting. I know you can think of like algorithms to use it with, but that's not something I use with user data. Split, if you're splitting on characters. Okay, the statement is if you need to find in an email address the reverse of a domain name. Okay, there may be some uses for reverse, but it's not a tool in my toolbox. And my toolbox very much includes Perl, mainly for three things: one-liners, scripting, and microservices, when it's the right job for what I want to do on the back end. I know there are a lot of other great uses, but that's how I use Perl. Length. This is a tricky one. How many characters is in my string? And this one is very important for your product, like Twitter. When you say 140 characters, how are you counting those characters? And there's no one right way to do it. Twitter uses code points. If you ask JavaScript, it's going to use UTF-16 code units, which I'm going to tell you that's always wrong. So don't use default JavaScript length. With Twitter, I understand the need to have some sort of restrictions. If you use Zalgo text, you could potentially have an infinite amount of characters in 140 grapheme clusters, or code points in 140 grapheme cluster. So there are reasons to restrict it, but you need to know what you're doing. And this is outside of just the engineering area. This is for product and UX designers to be in the loop in it as well. Everybody needs to know how we're defining these things as the product we're developing. And oftentimes, us as engineers, we're in the place to help define what we can do, what are our options, and how do we communicate those effectively. And then, even case conversions are important to keep in mind, both because there are, some cases where even what some would consider the length of characters change during conversion, but more importantly, case conversion can be problematic with your user's data. At Shutterstock, we work with human linguists to provide text in our 20 languages, or at least the 19 non-English languages. And one thing that I always have to keep on developers' cases about is when you want uppercase text to display to users, submit English uppercase text to our translators, and have them translate in the intended case and return it back. Because take Turkish. It has different casing rules where even ASCII characters map to non-ASCII characters, and if we apply arbitrary, UC and LC to those, that breaks Turkish text. Now there are some tools that do it better, ones where you can supply the locale of the known data. Modern browsers using CSS actually get this right if they know that the language is Turkish. That's another thing I get on some developer's case about making sure that you state in the HTML, HTML lang equals Turkish or whatever it is. You'd be surprised at how often I see this where it's just English for everything, regardless of the actual data used. And web browsers and CSS are becoming smarter and smarter about working with multilingual data. So it's important to state what the data is, but when avoidable, I still say it's the humans who know their language the best. So when it's the option to actually request a certain case from real humans, they're going to do it better than any programmatic way. Take title casing as well. In German, we title case a lot more words than English. In French and Spanish, we title case a lot less words than English. Yes, there are CSS text transforms that can do title casing for you, but it's going to do a subpar job, both with prepositions as well as especially with the local expectations of it. So that's again one thing that when it's an option, the humans will do it best. It's not always an option, so it's good to at least know the limitations when you are programmatically doing it. And, well, we talked about regular expressions already, and that this would match a Thai character, but it's actually going to match a Thai code point. And as we've already seen, user-perceived Thai characters can be composed of multiple code points. So what do we do? This could be a good interview question. So let's say wrap that Thai code point matcher using the Unicode property for the Thai script in a positive look-ahead, followed by a grapheme cluster matcher. So that's one way to go about it. And this could become cumbersome quickly. At least it's available. And at least Perl has great support for these basic units that you couldn't do any of this in JavaScript. Say the script matching or Unicode property matching, that's currently being discussed as an ECMAScript proposal. I've been putting input into that as well. There's a lot of really interesting work going on in proposing advancements in the ECMAScript regex standard, but it's still ongoing, and it's going to be a while before we can use any of these in the real world. So in the JavaScript world, oftentimes we have to go and say like in Node, find various NPM modules that can do the work for us. But fortunately in Perl, we can use the default regex engine. But again, I don't like this. This is what I have to work with right now. What I would like is something like this. And that's why I'm working on an actual Unicode proposal to standardize derived properties for grapheme clusters. There is no standard for this out there, so it's kind of the Wild West in what do we consider the properties of our grapheme cluster? What script is it? Is it a number? So on and so forth. Oftentimes you can do what we did over here and take the first code point and use those properties, but that does not always work. The base character isn't always the first code point, and some of them don't even make sense. What's the age it was added to Unicode? Plus there are other properties that would be very valuable. What if we could say in here, code points equals 5 and match any grapheme cluster that's composed of 5 code points. There are a lot of potential uses for derived properties. So that is very far away. It's only I have been talking about this in my head right now, and I'm working on a formal proposal for that, but I would love to see us eventually get to this point. And it's a problem that Perl 6 has right now because it works on the grapheme cluster level, but there's no standard for deriving these properties, and Perl 6 actually has really rich support for working with Unicode properties. Any Dutch speakers in the room? I know there are in the world. Okay. We've got Sawyer shyly half raising his hand. Do you know what this means? Okay. Well, it doesn't really matter. I don't know. I just used it for a character example. I thought it was a cool looking word. So, okay, what's going on here? Sometimes in Dutch, for emphasis, you add accents. And this is technically what you do on this, but it falls apart here. You would add the accent to the I, add the accent to the J. But there is no precomposed character with an accent on the J. And what's going on here? It's a font issue. And why am I showing you font issues? Most of us are not font designers in this room, or UX designers, and many of you are not front-end developers. But if you end up being the Unicode expert on your team, they are going to come to you with these problems, and it's good to know about them. It's important to even test in different fonts, and this is one that fonts just don't really get right. But it's also not a common usage in Dutch. It is a good example for, hey, this is a font issue. Change it over from that font to that. Even Comic Sans. It doesn't, note there that the accent's a completely different accent in Comic Sans. So oftentimes when we're reviewing fonts for usage, I have because people do come to me enough with all sorts of internationalization issues. I have a standard document I put together, and I'm like, okay, change the document to this font. It has all the characters for all our supported languages, plus pangrams in them, so I can give it a quick review and say, no, that font is horrible, or yes, that font will work. Make sure Cyrillic works and such. But it's good to have in your mind that things can break down on so many different levels. So I mentioned editor and Shutterstock editor, which is a web-based content editing tool. And we recently added emoji support, which was quite tricky. Emoji is text because many keyboards, including my own one right here, do not have the easiest way to add emoji. We gave a little built-in palette of emoji to work with. And this is an example of something that was built in editor. You could consider this to be plain text. It is entirely built up out of units of text with some light, font sizing and placement, some light markup. But this is the world we live in, where this is text, and our users expect to work with it. So, when we're building new products, it is important to have product manager, product owner, whoever is defining what we need to build. It could be a software development manager in some teams' cases, or just a stakeholder in others. When it comes to length of characters or what types of characters we support, such as if we're programmatically creating initials for someone, we need a product person to be in the loop here to at least know what is required out of this. it will take more work oftentimes. You can't just work with the tools that are built in, like the standalone functions in Perl all the times. It could take more work. Everybody needs to know that stating these product requirements ahead of time means that we're going to then build this out on the development side. And I find that more of the time, developers have more expertise in this area than the product folks. So all of us, it often comes to set the standard or set the expectations on our teams and to our stakeholders for what we can support and what that will take, especially in the tools in our toolkit, because it ranges from Perl to JavaScript and so forth. I have to work with all different languages and databases, and that's why I can't get into here like the varied support among all of them, because that would be a really boring talk. But if you know what you're looking for, you can find out what your systems support, and you can always just test it out. Which brings us to quality testing. It's also important for QA and unit tests and any type of automated testing to use real-world data and catch the problems before they make them out the door to production. And this is me and you. I'm giving you some career advice right here. It's also a very valuable skill to have. Technologies come and go. Eventually, programming languages come and go. We don't always have the option to use the technologies we prefer to use. I know I don't. And building up some what people think of as specialized skills here, but are very applicable to building global communities, building global businesses, are extremely valuable. Getting experience in these can quickly make you the expert on your team and can give you a lot of great experience for your resume, and you can apply it to whatever technologies you're working with in the future. And no matter what our shifting ecosystem is with tech stacks, that won't go away. You just need to learn how to apply it to a new system. And I would love to see some of you to join me in this October in Santa Clara for the Internationalization and Unicode Conference, where there will be a lot more that we'll get into on all different aspects of supporting users globally, supporting the languages of the world. So, any questions? Perl 5, version 26. And I just tested this out yesterday for the first time. I installed it yesterday.
I'm doing something wrong because I'm getting back 2 parts when I use backslash.
We'll have to get together privately after this, or with a group of whoever wants to take a look at it, and I will help you out.
Do you sometimes just store the data in the database because you deal with that in some kind of binary form and only take it in programming language?
This is a great question. If we sometimes store the data in the database in a binary form, and I have done that in cases where we don't really need to do any manipulation on the database side, nor do we need to do indexing on the database side, just need to do storage and retrieval. And it's actually easier to get things right when those are your limitations, because MySQL, for example, commonly gets things wrong. When it tries to work on the textual level, when it tries to work with characters and with case insensitivity and so on and so forth, everything can go wrong. And my biggest suggestion is work with your textual data as little as possible in your database. Databases in general have abysmal support for Unicode, and especially ones that even say they have support for it. It's just all over the place. And it makes life easier to stay out of the database side when you're working on the character level. It's not, sometimes you have to, but try to avoid it. It also keeps you very tied to specific database systems if you do too much work on the database side, and they are all different all over the place.
since you do have to index these strings that people input, there has to be some kind of normalization going on so that the different ways people type things that are semantically the same end up being found. That's like a talk on its own, I know, but like how much do you try?
Yes, Unicode Normalization is a talk on its own. Or it's a component of a different talk, but there's so much we can get into Unicode, and it's an important topic for programmers to know, because you can have different series of code points that are considered canonically equivalent. Users do not care that they are behind the scenes stored in memory or on database with different series of bytes. They just care about the fact that they look the exact same and should have the exact same semantics. So there are different normalization forms, and what it comes down to is normalizing on input makes the world an easier place. So if different systems work differently, take Perl, where we commonly decode on input, encode on output. Normalizing on input can also be beneficial, so we work with the same normal form. Anyone else? Thank you very much, everybody.
Where'd you get all those cool photos for your...
Let me tell you about this. My biggest benefit at Shutterstock is that I get free stock photography. Yes, we are hiring. I'm glad you asked. Yeah, when it comes to review time, I'm like, I don't want a raise. I don't want restricted stock units. I just want more stock photography. Raise my level. $750 a month is not enough for me. But yeah, I am trying to build up a team of folks to work not just in Perl, but in all different languages across the board on internationalization and localization. And we have quite a lot of jobs out there. I admit less Perl nowadays. We used to be one of the large Perl shops of New York City. But we do have a lot of interesting work going on the node side and in systems and ops and all over the place. So thanks for asking.
Just trying a different emoji. It was a pirate flags coming back in 2 parts. Family emoji that was multi-people came back as one. So I think it's the pirate flag is not being considered one thing.
The complexities of emoji.
I'd like to point out that even though 5.26 was the first language to support 9.0, just a few days after that, Perl 6 was the second language to support 9.0.
Straight from Larry, Perl 6 is the second language to support this after Perl 5.26. So it's quick to catch up.
Larry, Unicode 10 comes out in a week or two, so we'll have a race.
Yeah, one of the problems with Unicode is that it's released so soon before the annual Perl release. Although Unicode, I think they're moving the schedule up earlier in the year. I would love it if we could get things on a track to get the newest version of Unicode out sooner in Perl, because it is behind some languages. But yes, thanks again, and it was a pleasure talking with all of you.